Welcome back to our continuing series on becoming an evidence-based analyst. In this installment, we will begin our detailed review of how to evaluate evidence. We will begin with the highest quality grounding, the meta-analysis. As with each tutorial in this series, we will first quickly review the steps of EBA. A review of the steps will ensure that you are clear where this tutorial fits within the overall process of evidence-based analysis. The remainder of the tutorial will be a step-by-step guide to analyzing evidence from meta-analytic studies. As we progress through each step, you are encouraged to frequently pause this tutorial to practice the step on your own. To maximize the benefit of practice, apply the procedure to a question that is important to your profession. The new insights will expand your distinctive expertise, enabling or enhancing your capability as a thought leader and influential expert in your field. To practice the lessons of this tutorial, you should conduct a search of meta-analyses related to an answerable question that you are investigating. Scan the first page of search results. Select a couple meta-analyses to review. Practice the techniques on the articles you select. Post your findings to the discussion forum to showcase your developing distinctive expertise by sharing your insights with others. To sharpen your skills further, offer insights for discussion posts from others. Provide a PICO summary of a meta-analysis, whether for bonus points in a class or to impress your boss, colleagues, or friends with your depth of expertise. As discussed in the previous tutorials, there are 4 steps required to perform EBA. These steps allow us to develop a recommended solution to an important problem. We begin an evidence-based analysis by asking an answerable question. In the second step, we seek to find or develop a model of the causal factors and their effects. In step 3, we evaluate, compare, and systematically analyze the substantive effects across a variety of settings. The evaluation begins with rating the quality of evidence. The previous tutorial provided a step-by-step method for rating evidence quality. Once we have verified the quality rating, we examine the findings presented in a study. We need to determine if they support or pose reservations for the EBA model guiding the analysis. A systematic analysis requires that we determine how the effect size may vary across studies. A meta-analytic comparison can estimate with 90 or 95% confidence what the effect size will be for each causal factor. Therefore, meta-analysis allows you to determine how much confidence to have that a causal factor will impact a desired outcome. Finally, in step 4, we assess the risk of an evidence-based recommendation by calculating prediction and measurement risk. For this tutorial, we will continue with our investigation of the claim statement. An effective working relationship with your boss predicts all of the outcomes of organizational behavior. In other words, the exchange between a leader and a member of the organization is predicted to be a highly substantive influence on the desired organizational outcomes. This slide shows the final model produced in the Step 2, Part 2 tutorial. In Step 2, we examined 5 warrant models of the antecedents, or causal factors, and their consequences, or effects, of leader-member exchange, or LMX for short. This model predicted that transformational leadership will have a large effect on LMX. LMX was also predicted to consistently have a moderate effect on organizational commitment. LMX was predicted to have a less consistent effect on citizenship behavior and performance. In step 3, we will be examining and evaluating additional evidence for these effects. In this tutorial, we will use the findings of meta-analysis to determine a more accurate estimate of the effects. Next, a step-by-step process will be presented for locating and analyzing the meta-analysis results. We will conclude by synthesizing the results across meta-analyses to derive conclusions about the claim warranted by the model shown on this slide. We will begin by using a special search term, all in title, to limit our results. This search will only produce studies that specifically state in the title that meta-analysis was used to examine leader-member exchange effects. However, please remember that the words must be listed precisely as you wish them to appear in the title of the papers. That means, generally speaking, you should not use abbreviations when using an all-in-title search. After the conclusion of the tutorial, you will be asked to apply these techniques to develop an EBA presentation that uses meta-analysis to assess a claim that you are investigating. You can also apply the techniques discussed in this tutorial to develop a PICO summary of a meta-analysis providing insights related to a presentation posted in the discussion forum by others. There are 7 steps to evaluating evidence from a meta-analysis. First, we need to locate the tables of results in the paper. We can find the tables by searching for Table 1 using the Find function in Adobe Acrobat. We will examine both the text that describes a table and the content of the table. Depending on the objectives of the study, there may be one or more tables that we need to examine. We want to determine if the study reported a corrected correlation, or phi coefficient, and or a 95% or sometimes 90% confidence interval, or CI. Second, we need to confirm that the study examined the causal relationships that we are studying. This is most easily accomplished by verifying that the text describing the table references one or more of the factors that were included in the warrant model. Alternatively, the factors may be listed in the table header or in the rows or columns of the table. Most important, we need to ensure that the tables provide a way to connect one or more of the causes to one or more of the outcomes that appear in the warrant model. Third, we have to determine which effects are substantive based on the corrected correlations being greater than 0.3. The corrected correlation is also called a phi coefficient, as I mentioned earlier. The symbol used for the phi coefficient looks like an italicized P, but is actually the Greek letter rho, R-H-O. Meta-analyses report the corrected correlation in various ways. The simplest is a column under the phi coefficient, or that letter rho. Alternatively, you may find a series of columns making small correlation corrections leading up to a final mean corrected correlation. There are also other, less common formats. If you ever have difficulty interpreting a table, please post a question to the discussion forum. Either paste a screenshot of the table or attach a file with the table or the entire paper to the text of your post. Fourth, if provided, we examine the 90 or 95% confidence intervals to determine if under any conditions the effect of a causal factor is likely to fall below the substantive level. These effects should be noted as reservations because they represent insubstantial effect risk. This risk indicates that the model predictions may not result in a substantive impact of a factor under some conditions. Fifth, add to the model any factors with corrected correlations and confidence intervals that consistently show as having substantive impact. The new factors might be antecedents, in other words, additional causal factors, or they might be consequents, in other words, additional outcomes. 6. Summarize any and all meta-analyses that you analyzed using the PICO format. However, the PICO for a meta-analysis is unlike that of any other type of study. The population should be the search string, the search sources, and the sample size used to construct the meta-analysis study. Sample size of a meta-analysis is the number of studies analyzed and how many total samples were included in those studies. Notice an important distinction here. Unlike other types of evidence, the comparisons of a meta-analysis are not the measures included in a definitive claim. In a meta-analysis, the comparison is the meta-analytic calculations themselves. Accordingly, the comparison section of the PICO can simply state meta-analysis as the comparison. The interventions and the outcomes are very similar to other types of evidence. Seventh, and lastly, remove from the model diagram any of the original model correlation estimates that were studied by the meta-analysis. Replace these estimates with the corrected correlation and the confidence interval, if provided, in parentheses. Next, add the APA in-text citation for the meta-analysis study that provided those corrected correlations. Any factors that were not studied by the meta-analyses should still have their estimated correlation shown with the original reference number next to them. By leaving the original model citation number, we are indicating that these correlations are predicted rather than being grounded by the meta-analytic evidence. Now let's take a look at an example. We can analyze Gandura's claim about leader-member exchange by searching all in title, meta-analysis, leader-member exchange. Here we are in the Google Scholar homepage. To search, we would type in our command, all in title, meta-analysis, leader-member exchange. Click search. These are the results we receive from that search term, set of search terms. Notice there are about 25 results. The reason we receive so few results is because of the all in title command. This also ensures that we are going to find results that have all of these words included in the title. You can see that by the bolded text here and here. As we scroll down the page, notice some of these are in dark text with no ability to retrieve the document here on the right, so we can ignore those. All the others that have full text at IU South Bend or a direct link are accessible to us either directly or from a library. At the bottom, there'll be an opportunity to go to the second page to see additional files. And notice when we went to the second page that there were none beyond this. So there really is only one additional result. And if we notice here at the end of the subtitle line, it shows where this paper is from, and that clearly is not a journal title. So effectively, even though we got 25 results, we really only have one page we need to concern ourselves with. And again, because Google Scholar tends to put the best at the top, really these top few are what we should probably focus on. For this example, we'll just focus on these first two, the paper by Ellis, Nargang, and Morgeson, and Dulabon et al. From 2012. So let's take a look at each of these papers. This is the Dulabon paper, and here we have the paper that first came up at the top of the list by Ellis, Nargang, and Morgeson. When we find a paper and we pull it up in the Adobe framework, of course, we can always search what's in the paper. If we wanted to confirm that this was a meta-analysis, we would hit Control F or Command F if you were on a Mac, and we would be looking for the word corrected in the paper, as we see here. But we'd also want to make sure that that corrected applied to correlations. So here we see corrected and correlations in the same rough sentence, near each other anyway. And that gives us some assurance that this indeed is a meta-analysis. Of course, it also says meta-analysis procedures right here. And again, it listed in the title, so we can be confident that this is indeed a meta-analysis. However, if you do run across a paper where it came up in your search for a meta-analysis, you don't see meta-analysis in the title, you don't see meta-analysis listed in the method section like we see here, and let's say you didn't even find corrected correlation, you could also tell by the type of table that is produced, because the table has that phi coefficient. It also has the 90%, in this case, confidence interval. Notice there's another type of interval called a credibility interval that we're not interested in. So it's the CI, or confidence interval, and the phi coefficient, or the rho letter, Greek rho, that indicates to us that this is indeed a meta-analysis. Of course, again, it says meta-analysis results right here. Our next step in our process then is to, now that we know that we've located the tables and We've confirmed that the study is indeed looking at a meta-analysis. We want to make sure that the study is indeed examining the causal relationships that we had predicted in our warrant model. So we see citizenship behavior here, citizenship behavior target. And this paper was about leader-member exchange. And we can confirm that by noticing in Table 1, it presents the meta-analysis results for the overall relationship between LMX and citizenship behaviors. So indeed, this study is indeed going to tell us about the relationships that were predicted by the warrant model. Now, again, if we had not been here, if I was at the top of the document, after confirming again that it is a meta-analysis, I could simply type in Table 1 and have it take me right to that text in the results section where it describes Table 1. And at the end, I would be able to confirm that LMX is being related to citizenship behaviors in this particular study. Our next step is to then determine what substantive correlation coefficients were found. To do that, we need to look here at Table 1. And specifically, we're going to look in the phi, or Greek letter rho, column. Any result that's 0.3 or higher is a potential substantive correlation. But before we conclude that, in this case, every single one of these findings was indeed substantive, we also want to look at the 90% CI column, or the lower and upper bounds of the CI. Specifically, we're interested in the lower bound if it is a positive correlation, or the upper bound if it is a negative correlation, and that's simply because of the way these correlations are reported in a meta-analysis. As we look at the lower bound here, we notice that this 0.27 is below 0.3 and 0.29 is below 0.3, and therefore both organizational citizenship behavior and when analyzing the effects of LMX on citizenship behavior use different perspectives, there is a risk that for some conditions, it will not have a substantive effect. LMX will not substantively influence citizenship behavior. Now, if we want to know, well, what does this mean? Same perspective, different perspective. Again, the search function is very useful here. And so we could type in different perspective. We probably want to start actually by going to the top of the page. So typically what I will do is close that find button, go to the top of the document, and type different perspective so that we can understand what is being talked about here. And so this says that there were correlations between constructs measured from different perspectives. The same perspective was being rated by the same person. In other words, somebody rating themselves. Whereas a different perspective was when the followers were rated by their supervisors. So now when we look at this information, we can get a better understanding of what's going on, that if somebody rates themselves, indeed, LMX appears to have a substantive effect on citizenship behavior. Although, again, because of the result here, we know it's more for individual behavior than it is for organizational commitment or organizational citizenship. However, if the supervisor is the one conducting the rating, now even the individual citizenship behavior may not be substantive. So this is how we would analyze a meta-analytic study. We'd also want to scan the paper to make sure there were no other tables. And in this case, there was only one. Let's try this again with the paper produced by Dulabon and co-authors. So again, here we would search for corrected to see if we could find corrected in the paper. We'd first search to make sure that it was dealing with correlations, and we see here the weighted mean correlation was indeed being corrected for measurement and sampling error. So we know it's a meta-analysis study, and of course, again, meta-analytic procedures were used, which again would confirm that it's a meta-analysis study. We would then search for Table 1. And here we'd see that Table 1 is looking at the relationship between LMX and a series of other variables. So again, we can confirm that this study is indeed relating to the warrant model. But we don't necessarily know what are these other variables. So we'd have to scan down and find Table 1, and here it is. Again, it confirms that it's a meta-analysis. Again, we see here we have the phi coefficient. And we also have our confidence interval, in this case, a 95% confidence interval. Notice these other columns. Other columns, to give you a quick feel for what they provide us, K is the number of studies in which these variables were analyzed. The N column is telling us the total number of people that were involved across all those studies. The R column is the uncorrected correlation. Be careful never to use the R column in a meta-analysis. The phi coefficient, or rho column, is the one that we typically would use when analyzing a meta-analysis. Well, I say typically because if we have a confidence interval, we want to make sure to not only use that column, but also to include the confidence interval in our analysis. SD with the phi coefficient means the standard deviation. That's how much that phi coefficient varies. And these other statistics we can ignore for our analysis. So we're going to focus on which of the factors showed a substantive phi as a corrected correlation, and then we're going to verify that that phi remains substantive throughout the range of the confidence interval. So scanning down here, we see that competence, for instance, LMX did show a substantive relationship with the follower characteristic of competence. And notice at the top it says antecedents of leader-member exchange, which means competence is predicting the level of leader-member exchange behavior. But while the estimated corrected correlation is indeed substantive, the lower CI is not, and therefore we would not include competence in our revised model. So if we have a confidence interval range, sometimes it's even easier to go down that range and look for items that indeed were above 0.3. And so looking down here, we don't see very many. Here's one. So contingent reward behavior, which is associated with transactional leadership, not transformational leadership, shows a very large, or at least large, 0.73 corrected correlation with leader-member exchange. And that range will be from 0.58, which is a moderate effect, up to 0.88, which is indeed a large effect. So contingent reward behavior is something we would want to include in our model. But if you recall, that wasn't included in the original model, which focused on transformational leadership. Transformational leadership indeed had the same exact effect as transactional leadership, 0.73 as the best estimate, but it ranged from 0.64 to 0.81. So these two seem fairly similar. And in fact, if transformational leadership and transactional leadership both have an effect on leader-member exchange, we can't simply think that transformational leadership is all that matters. Continuing down, here's another one, 0.32 to 0.43. So supervisors' expectations of followers is something we're going to want to include in our model, with the best estimate being 0.37. Continuing down, here's another one, 0.38 to 0.61. Affect or liking, the interpersonal relationship between the supervisor and the organizational member, is a substantive factor, with the best estimate being a correlation of 0.49, but the range from 0.38 to 0.61. And finally, the last one is leader trust. Again, another very substantive factor, 0.73, indicating a large effect of leader trust, or the trust of the member in the leader, as being a predictor of leader-member exchange. To what extent will the leader and the member exchange information and exchange other types of communication? Again, the range here is quite good, from 0.64 to 0.84. So this is how we analyze a meta-analysis table. But this is, again, table 1. Like we did with the last paper, we want to scroll down and see if there's any other tables. And sure enough, in this paper, there is a table 2. That first table looked at the antecedents of leader-member exchange. And if you recall the warrant model, it had transformational leadership as the only antecedent. We have found from this study that indeed there are additional antecedents that should be included in an evidence-based model. This table looks at the consequences of leader-member exchange. The consequences are the outcomes. These are the factors that leader-member exchange influences. Once again, we use the same process. We look down our lower and upper CI to determine if indeed we have substantive factors. Now notice this first one, negative 0.43 to negative 0.36. This is the effect on turnover intentions. Because the effect is negative, meaning it has an inverse effect, as leader-member exchange improves, turnover intention should decline. But because it's negative effect, we have to actually look at the upper level to determine whether this factor should be included in our model because it indeed is substantive. And of course it is. 0.36, the absolute value of negative 0.36, is above 0.3. Therefore, we would want to include the relationship between leader-member exchange and turnover intention in our model, with the best estimate being a negative 0.39 effect. But while it affects turnover intention, which is basically a perceived belief that I'm likely to consider leaving the organization, actual turnover, whether they actually leave or not, was indeed not substantive. So leader-member exchange doesn't affect whether people actually leave, only whether they might think about leaving. We also find that it has an effect that remains consistently above substantive levels for organizational citizenship behavior, for job performance, for overall organizational commitment, for affective commitment, for general job satisfaction, for satisfaction with the supervisor, for procedural justice, for distributive justice, for empowerment, for perceptions of politics, for role ambiguity, and that's it. So this table has given us a number of new insights regarding the effect of leader-member exchange on a series of organizational behavior factors that Scandura predicted should be impacted by leader-member exchange. Again, we will want to confirm that this is the final table in the study. We scroll down further. Indeed, there is a third table, but this table is only looking at mediation tests. This is looking at to what extent is leader-member exchange mediating the effect of one causal factor on a different outcome factor. This table is a good example of how we want to analyze when we're looking at tables to ensure that they relate. We want to make sure what is it they're telling us. The leader-member exchange here is being used as the mediator. Well, our model did not have leader-member exchange as a mediator, except for the effect of transformational leadership, and transformational leadership here is shown as an outcome, not a cause. So, it is a cause, but the mediation we have from up above. So we can pretty much ignore this table. It also only gives us betas and not phi coefficients. So this table is not going to be used in our final analysis. That's it for analyzing meta-analysis tables. Now let's see what we can conclude from this as we resume our presentation. This is the PICO analysis that is produced for the first study we looked at, Illes, Nargang, and Morgeson 2007. As with all PICO analyses, you begin by searching the paper for the method section. In the method section, we will find in the first part of that method section what the population was for the study. In this study, the population was determined by the search terms vertical dyad linkage, dyad and leader, LMX, and leader-member exchange, along with a manual search of in-press articles. The source was the PsycInfo database from the period of 1887 to 2005, and this resulted in a sample size of 51 studies and 50 independent samples. 2 of the studies shared the same sample. The intervention was pretty simple. It was leader-member exchange and its effects on organizational and individual citizenship behavior. The comparison was meta-analysis, as it always is in a meta-analysis. The comparison is the meta-analytic calculations. The outcome results of this first study was that LMX was found to have a small effect on overall citizenship behavior. But that effect differed depending on whether the beneficiary was another individual, where it was a little higher, or was organizational citizenship behavior. In the latter case, OCB showed an insubstantial effect risk because the confidence interval fell below the threshold of 0.3. Furthermore, the effects of leader-member exchange on citizenship behavior differed based on how the study was conducted. If they used subjective or perceptual data, such as self-report, the effects seemed to be moderate, with a corrected correlation of 0.54. However, if actual citizenship behavior was observed by a supervisor, taking a different perspective, an outside perspective, on that individual's relationship between leader-member exchange and their citizenship behavior, the effect was much smaller, with a corrected correlation of 0.32, and also the potential for insubstantial effect risk. Before we advance to the next slide, you may wish to stop the tutorial here and analyze yourself the paper by Dubaume et al. 2012. You should conduct a PICO analysis by searching the method section, finding the population, the intervention, the outcomes, recognizing that the comparison will simply be meta-analysis. I will pause for a few moments here to allow you time to pause this tutorial. When you have completed your analysis, resume it, and we will give you an opportunity to compare your analysis with the one I conducted. Here is the PICO analysis for the Dubaume et al. 2012 paper. I will not go through the specifics. If you have questions on how I derived any of this data, please post a question in the discussion forum. A systematic review model summarizes the results of a meta-analytic comparison. In our example, the systematic review model shows the results of our analysis of two meta-analyses. Collectively, these two studies examine the predicted direct effects of LMX. Additionally, one substantive antecedent of LMX, interpersonal relationship, and additional substantive consequent factors, job satisfaction and a group of perceptual outcomes, were discovered through our analysis. These new factor relationships are outlined in red in the systematic review diagram. Overall, the results for our analysis support Skandura's claim. Clearly, developing skills in leader-member exchange behaviors would be important to your future success as a leader. However, you should note that the factors connected to and above the red lines are all forms of perceptual outcomes. They are what the worker feels or perceives. The outcomes listed at the top of the diagram are determining whether the worker feels committed or feels they are likely to leave the organization. Similarly, job satisfaction and other perceptual outcomes all relate to how a worker feels, but not necessarily how they would act. Generally, these perceptual or subjective effects of LMX are the strongest. The two objective factors, job performance and citizenship behavior, were much less impacted by leader-member exchange behaviors. This was highlighted by the Illes, Dargang, and Morgenson 2007 study. They found that self-ratings of citizenship behavior, of perception, showed a moderate impact from LMX, but the supervisor rating of actual citizenship behavior was barely substantive. The study by Dubaume et al. 2012 provides deeper insight into why there may be a difference between perception and reality in terms of the behavioral impact of LMX. As a reservation to the initial model, transactional leadership behaviors, such as providing contingent rewards, were found to be just as effective as transformational leadership behavior. Therefore, the type of leader, or their leadership style, may not matter as much as the behaviors that encourage an exchange, an interaction, between the supervisor and the subordinate. Finally, much more important may be the nature of the interpersonal relationship between a supervisor and the member of the organization. Do they like each other? Do they trust each other? Both of these effects were found to generally have a moderate to large impact on the exchange between leadership and the workers. This may also explain why there is a small impact on the exchange if the supervisor expects the exchange to be a positive one. Now it's your turn. You should practice applying the evidence evaluation process that we have reviewed in this tutorial. First, identify one or more causal or outcome factors that you find personally interesting or which you believe will be important to your future career. Determine if a designative claim has been proposed regarding the factors. If so, then locate a model that explains and predicts how the causal factors should impact the desired outcomes, as we did in the previous tutorial. Next, search Google Scholar for meta-analytic studies that examined one or more of the causal or outcome factors. Follow the process we have outlined in this tutorial to revise the warrant model. Summarize the studies you find using PICO. Draw a new model diagram based on the corrected correlations and the confidence intervals associated with each. In upcoming tutorials, we will be reviewing the other forms of grounding that can be used to test the validity of a warrant model. When evaluating a model, it is always best to start with a meta-analysis and then fill in any gaps that remain by searching for other forms of grounding. The meta-analysis tutorial that we have just completed may be the most important of the 4 tutorials on evaluating grounding studies. I say this because meta-analysis is the highest quality grounding. You will find that searching for and analyzing meta-analytic studies allows you to rapidly produce an evidence-based analysis. The meta-analysis can provide you with a shortcut for developing or evaluating a claim statement. There are fewer meta-analyses conducted, so therefore less to analyze. You can quickly locate most meta-analyses using the all-in-title search filter. When we discuss step 4 in an upcoming tutorial, you will also find that the confidence intervals produced by the best meta-analyses enable you to rapidly estimate prediction risk. In sum, locating and analyzing a meta-analysis is an essential skill of an evidence-based analyst. Therefore, you should replay this tutorial as often as needed to master the concepts. Plan to practice each of the steps often to convert your knowledge into skill. During your practice, draw your own model of the substantive results that you find in the meta-analyses. Compare these models to the path models that result from a quasi-experiment, like a structural equation model. You should also compare models derived from more than one meta-analysis. As we have shown here, the systematic review model that results from a meta-analytic comparison offers deeper insights. Using a systematic review, we better understand how and why certain factors are more influential than others. Knowing the relative effectiveness of one factor or a group of factors over others is distinctive expertise. You will find this critical thinking skill is required to perform well on exams used to certify you as an evidence-based analyst.